Hey guys, welcome to Braddels Gaming, and to finally another speed build commentary on the channel. I haven't done a speed build commentary since February of 2022 with Perth City Paintball, but here we're finally doing another speed build commentary. Basically what happens in this video is I show you sped up footage of me building a map in the Far Cry 5 map editor, and then I commentate over the process from start to finish, which gives you guys an insight into what I'm doing as a creator whilst I'm building on screen. And it's pretty well condensed. I mean, the video is still about an hour long or just over an hour, but you know, it's a video concept that I actually borrowed from a fellow Far Cry content creator in Sambuilds, and Sambuilds started doing this about 5 years ago when Far Cry 5 first came out, and it's a video concept that I found really engaging and is something that I wanted to do on my channel for a long time. And I think it was back in 2021, I asked Sam if I'd be able to borrow the concept for my own YouTube channel here at Braddels Gaming, and Sam was more than happy to let me fulfill that dream I had. So here we are with the second speed build commentary. Now what I like to do in these speed build commentaries is I like to show you the sped up footage, but occasionally what you're also going to be seeing me doing is actually jumping into the map in explore mode in real time and seeing me kind of explore the map for myself, and it'll just slow down the video from time to time, allowing you guys to kind of see the process, or not the process, but rather the progress of the map in real time, which is just going to allow you guys to really take it all in a lot clearer than when it is obviously sped up. But of course, I really like the sped up stuff as well, because if the video wasn't sped up, it would be 16 hours long, which I don't think many people would be here to watch that. So hopefully, this is a series on the channel that can become a real staple, and I hope you guys enjoy this series as much as I loved this series over on Sam's channel. Sam, of course, is not going to be doing YouTube anymore, which is obviously quite a sad thing, but of course really do respect his decision to leave YouTube for obvious personal reasons. As you get older, life kind of starts to take over with regards to work and all sorts of other things, and I also believe Sam is meant to be getting married soon as well, so that's some very exciting news for Sam and his partner Emma. But with all the niceties out of the way, I guess you could call them, I'm now going to start talking about the map that I am building today. Now this map is simply called Forest Friction. It's a map actually inspired by a few different things. Mainly a conversation that I had with some random American guy over on the Xbox about 3 years ago now, and also the Waco siege, I believe it was, in Texas. For general context, the Waco siege, now note that I'm not the biggest historian, but you know, I try. The Waco siege was when the US government basically stormed the compound of, I think, some sort of religious cult leaders compound in Texas. And yeah, so the government went in and they basically fought against these religious fanatics. And yeah, it was like a real massacre or something like that. Now this map isn't strictly based on that. It is still very much my own imagination coming into play. In fact, funnily enough, this map, whilst it is kind of inspired by the Waco siege, it's also kind of an idea that I kind of just thought of. I find with myself, when I'm coming up with map ideas, they kind of just come to me every now and then at really random times. And I don't exactly actually remember when I came up with the idea for this map, but I just sort of figured out what kind of layout I wanted to go for. And what you'll see just in a little bit is actually the layout that I drew on Word document for this map. I decided that I would show you guys kind of the layout to which I'm building this map for. It's not really something I do all the time. A lot of the time I kind of just come up with a general idea for a map and then I kind of just improvise and go from there. But for this map, I actually had a pretty kind of rigid structure for how I wanted the map to kind of be laid out. And that's something that I'll show you over on Word document very, very soon, which will be edited into this speed build as well. But the other inspiration for the map was kind of just this random conversation that I had with some American guy over on the Xbox a few years ago that I used to play Far Cry with. And yeah, he was a really funny guy, but he was also pretty knowledgeable, and he would talk. I had a conversation with him about militias in the USA. And yeah, I don't know. It was just a really funny, fun sort of spontaneous conversation that we had about militias in the US. And I've kind of based this map around a militia in the US, not a specific one necessarily, but kind of just the idea of a militia group in the woods, that this is kind of their compound. And the kind of backstory, the kind of narrative that I've come up with for this map is that one team is a SWAT team who is trying to take down this militia for whatever reason. And the militia is kind of just defending this kind of compound that they call home, I suppose. So that's kind of the narrative, kind of the inspiration for the map that we're going to be building today. And now I'll hop over to Word document so you can kind of see the layout that I wanted this map to kind of become. And what you'll probably notice during this speed build is how the layout of the map takes shape around this kind of plan that I drew up in Word document. Now, I would have used Paint, but I don't really have Paint on my computer anymore, so I decided the next best thing I can use is, of course, Word document. And thankfully, Word document has some really helpful drawing tools that you can use. No, this isn't sponsored by Microsoft or Microsoft Word. Maybe I'll get there one day, but yeah, this is kind of the layout that, for whatever reason, just came into my head one particular afternoon. And so what you have is you have the front wooden fence entrance with a private keep out sign, which isn't going to actually feature in today's build. So that's one of the things that I don't put in, but I do put a smaller kind of warning sign from the Far Cry 5 asset category. And you can kind of see that the layout kind of snakes up this hill, this canyon hilltop sort of area. You've got rocks here, you've got an open field here, you've got a flanking route on the back of this kind of rock structure here. You've got a zip line and a grapple point that is kind of a secret flanking route for either team. So whether you're on the SWAT team, well, your kind of secret flank route is the grapple point. And if you're on the militia team, your secret expressway is down a zip line. You've got an MG turret, you've got mortar, you've got cabin, you've got the campsite, a watchtower, and a camp fence. And you've kind of got this middle chasm area here. And these are all sorts of things that you're going to see featured in the rest of the speed build. Some of them are absent because I didn't actually consider putting them in at the very end. And there are actually some other things on this plan that isn't shown that I put in the map as well. So that's the layout for Forest Friction. Now I'm just continuing to work on this canyon pass up the hill, and as you can see, I actually kind of erased my progress with the terrain there just because I decided to redo that part of the terrain. And what you're going to start seeing me do is start to add a little bit of rocks here and there and some different vegetation variations. As you might see from my map building style is that I like to kind of jump around quite a bit. I think it kind of keeps me interested in the map build and kind of allows me to work on multiple different things in the map at the one time, which allows me as a builder, I feel like, to kind of be better at building, because I feel like if I focus on one part of the map, I can sometimes become a little bit too narrow focused. So I kind of like to work on multiple things in one kind of spate of time. And so as I work on creating the zipline flank or the expressway for the militia team to get down the mountain a lot quicker by also adding these rock forms right next to that zipline. These rock forms here are just to help with the sightlines of the map. I don't want to give the militia team up on the campsite a full direct view of the SWAT team coming up the mountain, so I add those rock structures both for some natural nice aesthetic, but also to help the SWAT team in moving up the hilltop. And here you can start seeing me actually fixing that kind of hilltop part of the map that I originally erased just before. I felt like the original kind of hilltop that I made out of the terrain was just a little bit too flat and wasn't really the right type of gradient that I wanted for the map in terms of the portion where the SWAT team has to essentially climb up the hill. And so you can see me just working here, just trying to smooth it all out, trying to really refine it in terms of the size. I had a bit more width to the mountain side and place the rocks that is basically going to form the central part of cover that the SWAT team has to use in climbing up the hilltop, especially from the mounted gun, which you saw me just place just then. And this is probably going to be real hot real estate for anyone on the militia team. I'm sure that when anyone or everyone spawns in from the militia team's perspective, that everyone's pretty much going to run straight to the mounted gun, because mounted guns in Far Cry are pretty powerful, and if you can get onto one and line up a lot of enemies, you're going to have a very nice field day with a lot of kills in that particular multiplayer match. I always remember in Sam Build's multiplayer Fault Wars Vietnam map that this was exactly the case, that on the map there were 2 mounted guns for either team's fortress on the opposing banks of the river in that particular map. And everyone would always try and rush to the mounted guns because they were so powerful. You could get so many kills with them in each particular game. And I was definitely one of those real guilty offenders where I would rush to the mounted gun and pick up about 10 kills to start each multiplayer game on that map. It was a blast. And some of my fondest memories on Far Cry just really kind of making people rage quit on that particular map. So sorry, anybody that fell victim to any mounted machine gun fire from playing that particular map. I do apologize, but it was all in the spirit of fun and the game. So with the machine gun turret placed, I believe that's the final location of the machine gun turret. I do kind of adjust the rocks here. Actually, no, I did slightly change the location of the turret just then to meet where I kind of readjusted the rock structure to, and that mounted gun kind of overhangs the cliff on the militia side of the mountain, as it kind of overlooks this sort of hilltop, this sort of valley area where I'm placing the rocks now. And I kind of go into the editor quite a bit just to kind of test out that machine gun turret location, because I kind of wanted to make that machine gun turret a real kind of powerful position for the militia to use to thwart any attacks from the SWAT team coming up the mountain. But also I didn't want it to be a super overpowered position, and so I only used the M60 mounted gun. I didn't use the M250 because let me just say right here and right now that if I was to use the M250, there is absolutely no way the SWAT team is getting up that mountain. So I just decided to use the M60, the mounted M60. It's still a very powerful gun, but not as powerful as the M250. And I also wanted to place the M60 at a level that would allow it to pick off players that would climb up the exposed part of the mountain. And then as you can kind of see me doing here, I'm kind of creating a extra flank route that is kind of closer to the mountain side on the non-militia side of the map. And this flanking route is going to be slightly sunken into the ground to kind of give it a little bit extra cover and protection from that mounted gun. But also what you see later on is when I add a lot more greenery and forestation and all that other good stuff, you'll see that players are able to blend in with the environment really well. And that's another thing to note. I feel like on this map there isn't necessarily a lot of physical cover, but there's definitely a lot of soft cover, a lot of camouflage cover that players can really utilize to their advantage to kind of hide from the enemy. And so if you do happen to have the privilege of playing this map yourself, maybe dress in something green, because I feel like that's definitely going to help you perform a little bit better in terms of being able to hide from the enemy. And as I continue to do, I jump into the map just to gain a first person perspective and to test out a few sightlines. And that's kind of I guess a map editor tip I would give anyone making a map, that you should always try and jump into explore mode quite a lot so you can get a sense of scale of the map, and you can kind of see in a first person perspective what your map kind of looks and feels like. And also you can pick up a lot of things as well in first person that you might not actually be able to pick up in the map editor view. For example, I think later on in the speed build, I noticed on one of my explore mode first person perspective tours that I found some floating rocks that I didn't actually see in the map editor view. I might have actually been able to see them in the map editor view, but just going into first person, you definitely pick up a lot more things and a lot more smaller things such as that you wouldn't have picked up otherwise. Now I just work on really trying to align this cliff face with a lot of rocks and the terrain tools to really kind of smooth it out so that it maintains the edge of a cliff face of this kind of mountain slash hill, but is still smooth enough that players who are on that edge of the cliff are going to be able to move around seamlessly. And so I kind of just try to blend a lot of the terrain textures and the terrain tools and the rocks all together as one, because I think that if you're ever working with terrain in Far Cry 5 in the map editor, you really want to kind of use all three methods of building a terrain environment, and that is to use the rocks, the terrain textures, and the terrain itself to kind of create a lot of different modulation and variation to really make that environment that you're building look really natural. And as you can see, this is kind of sprinkling on the 100s and thousands on the last bit, which is to add the vegetation. Now, most of the time, I'll just use the collection tool as the way to sprinkle vegetation around the map. But what you would have seen flash up very quickly is I actually made my own kind of asset pack, I guess you could call it, where I combined a few different plants together and then duplicated that over onto the actual map's playable area. I don't really do that too much, but I figured I really wanted to kind of customize the vegetation in that particular part of the map, and so that's what I ended up doing on this map specifically. Now it's time to turn our attention to the entrance to the campsite. And I already placed a wooden kind of fence from the front gate at the very bottom of the hill. But now I'm just kind of spawning in different objects, different structures, kind of debating about what to use, and I end up going for a kind of catwalk structure with a few Far Cry Primal towers as well, and then combine that with the wooden fence that I used from the bottom of the hill. And you can see that the width of the catwalk structure doesn't actually reach the entirety of that opening in the hill between the two rock structures on either side, and so I end up just bringing in those rock structures a little bit, adding some trees, and just really trying to close up the space so that for the most part there's only really one way that people can get in and out of the camp, at least from this approach, and that's through the camp's main entrance. However, there is a little gap that you can actually kind of bypass the camp's entrance through, which you'll see later on in the video. And so here I'm basically just trying to, really close in this space with a lot of different trees and rocks and things like that. And you can actually see me use the set to height tool to also allow trees to actually be placed on top of the rocks, because you can only really spawn trees and vegetation like collection tools on terrain, and so you can't really directly place it on a rock because a rock is actually just an asset. It's not actually a terrain tool or anything like that. And so I use the set to height tool to raise the terrain up just below the rock structures so that I can actually place trees on top of those rock structures themselves. Now we get into the actual bunker for where the mounted machine gun is, and spoiler alert, this isn't actually the real bunker that is in the final version of the map. This is more of a prototype, and so it might look pretty makeshift and kind of ugly looking, but I definitely changed the look and feel of the bunker structure. What I do is I still use kind of the wooden platform that you see here with a combination of sandbags, but I actually changed the bunker structure to, I believe this is a Far Cry 5 Hours of Darkness set, and it's just this nice kind of wooden looking bunker structure, and it kind of keeps with the theme of this map, which is a lot of wooden kind of assets. Obviously, this map is based in a very woodland forested environment, so it makes sense that there are kind of a lot of structures that are made out of wood, whether that be the front entrance at the bottom of the hill, the campsite entrance, or this bunker itself. There is definitely a lot of wooden structures in this map in keeping with the theme and the environment of a woodland setting. I also continue to build the sandbags around the wooden structure as well, just to provide a little bit extra cover and to make it look like this is a pretty well prepared defensive fortification for the militia team. But those sandbags also play another role. I don't actually do it just yet, but I definitely add a few more sandbags on the left side of that bunker just to kind of minimize the field of view that the militia team gets from that position a little bit. That way, if the SWAT team does happen to make it up the main hill incline most of the way, there are actually those sandbags, ironically protecting them to get up that final stretch. And you'll see me add that later on in the video, and I'll comment more about that as well. But now I am basically creating the sort of main flanking route for the main hill incline here by syncing the terrain and using the set to height tool. And I feel like if you're ever working with terrain, the set to height tool is definitely your best friend in the Far Cry 5 map editor. For me at least, I find it's one of the most useful terrain tools to use because it really just gives you so much freedom in terms of giving you the ability to shape the terrain in how you want it to be shaped. And the set to height tool, well, pretty self-explanatory. It's such a useful tool to just be able to set the height of the terrain to whatever level you want it as. If you compare it to the bump tool, for example, the bump tool doesn't really give you anywhere as near as much control. And so the set to height tool is just so helpful and so particular in allowing you to specify the height of the terrain and really shape your map around that. So you can really do a lot of things with the set to height tool. You can build trenches that are really kind of narrow and rigid in their structure in terms of them being very rectangular. Or you can just build things like this sort of flanking route here, which is just to create a bit of deviation in the land. So it kind of acts as a natural trench for the SWAT team when they're climbing up this hill, so that they don't necessarily have to just run up the hill and hope that they don't take any fire through the open exposed bit closer to the cliff, but they can actually take this alternate route, which is just going to make the map a lot more balanced and allow the SWAT team to bypass that amount of machine gun turret as well. And so whilst I work on the flanking route on this main hill incline, I also work on the rest of this hill, just trying to make sure that there is the right amount of forest and vegetation in this part. Really want to make it detailed, and as you can see, I start applying the color textures to this part of the map, which makes the map look so much more complete than what it was before when it was just the white default mesh on there. And we're really starting to see the vibrancy of all the nature come together. And I kind of played with a lot of different options here in terms of different collection tools and kind of what I wanted to go for. I ended up going with the flowers with a mix of some short and tall trees along this section because I wanted this to kind of be more of an open field, but I still wanted to maintain the feel of a woodland setting. And I felt like the amount of trees that I ended up putting here was about the right amount of trees that I was hoping for. There's just enough that it kind of keeps with that theme, but not so much that it's absolutely cluttering this section of the hill, which my vision for it was to be a bit of an open area, just to give a little bit more variety to the map. There is already a few sections that are very heavily forested, but this section alone I really want to kind of keep it a little bit more open. And that also makes it easier for the SWAT team to move up the hill without having any kind of physical obstructions in the way. And it also makes this part of the map quite interesting from a gameplay perspective because it's a lot more of an open area. There is probably going to be a lot more medium to long range combat here, as opposed to some other areas of the map, which is a lot more kind of CQB close quarters action. And as the bunker on top of the militia's hilltop camp has free reign over this entire area, it really emphasizes the importance of the integration of that flanking point to the right. In terms of an area that is close quarters though, we now come to the ravine where I'm adding a lot more trees. Now this ravine is specifically the part of the hill that is near the start of the SWAT team spawn. So after they have vaulted over the main fence at the bottom of the hill, they then come into a pretty claustrophobic part of the map, which is again this ravine, which is quite close on either side of the player. there is two kind of rocky formations on either side, and then there's a bunch of trees that I've added down the center. And this is to promote a little bit more close quarters engagement in this part of the map. Again, adding some variation for the players so that a variety of game styles can be catered for, but it also just kind of follows the natural progression of the terrain in terms of the hill that I'm building, that it kind of is quite narrow at the beginning, at the start, but as you go up the hill, it widens out. Now I'm adding some arrow signage for the SWAT team as they go up the hill, just to give them a little bit of guidance about where to go. Because of the terrain itself, there is kind of a rock formation in the way that suggests that the player should go straight rather than around, and so I just add that arrow signage there because I didn't really want to make the secret flanking route that they have immediately obvious. This secret flanking route in the form of a grapple point gives any player, but to greater effect the SWAT team as they make their charge up the hill, the ability to bypass the entire hill section altogether, with immediate access to the militia's campsite. And so I didn't really want to make it immediately obvious that that was a secret pathway they could take, because I really wanted to reward the player on the map that was a little more explorative, rather than just giving every player a free pass. And for the SWAT team as a whole, once they collectively find this secret flanking route, they should find it a little easier to turn the tide of the battle, again making this sense of finding something off the beaten track just that extra bit rewarding. But aside from this, the arrow actually acts as an early warning sign for the SWAT team as well. I'm not exactly sure when I tested this out, but another thing I like to do in every single multiplayer map I've built to date is essentially calculate where the middle part of the map is, the part of the map players from either team is most likely to encounter each other. The way I measure this is by spawning into the map in either team's spawn, then timing the amount of time it takes me to get from that spawn to the other side of the map. After doing a timed run for either team, I then calculate from that which area of the map is the middle point for either team in terms of the amount of time it takes each team to get to that point from the spawn I measured from. And the middle point of the map that I have measured for Forest Friction is the arrow pointing towards the main hill incline. So hopefully this arrow acts as a subtle warning sign for the SWAT team to swivel their heads in the right direction, as if they head straight on, they're very likely to receive some fire from any member of the militia team rushing down the hill to their position. And so I definitely recommend using this method when building multiplayer maps if you haven't already, particularly those that are mostly linear like this one. It just gives you as the creator the knowledge of knowing where players are most likely to first encounter each other, and as the creator you can therefore have more foresight when you're building a map, as you very early on in the build know where this point is and can plan accordingly. This can help you to make the middle point of the map more interesting, increase or decrease its size as you see fit, and or help with map balancing as you may decide to elongate the pathway of one team's approach to this point to give the other team more time to get to a specific point on the map that you want them at. Or in my case, add an arrow sign for one of the teams to give them a hint about where the enemy is most likely going to be coming from. This saves a bunch of time for you as the creator, as you don't have to guess the middle point yourself when building a map, or having to publish it first and test it out in a multiplayer game. With this method, you straight away have that foresight of knowing where it is and can plan accordingly. Moving on with the map, we now come to the entrance to the militia team's fortress or campsite. And here I'm just working on adding a ladder to the entrance and also adding a little bit more fencing. The ladder was a real issue because I kept trying to connect the ladder to the catwalk platform, so it didn't look like the ladder was just kind of standing on its own, but that it was leaning on something. But because the ladder has physics as it is a climbable object, it meant that the ladder just wasn't really liking me connecting it to the catwalk platform, and so it was a lot of adjusting back and forth until the map editor got the better of me and I just caved in because because I simply just allowed the ladder to kind of stand on its own very unrealistically, but it's not really something that I think many players are really going to notice or really care about. And as a creator, sometimes we just have to make sacrifices, whether they be aesthetics type sacrifices or other type of sacrifices, and this is one of the sacrifices that I had to make to this map. Not a very big one, but nonetheless still a sacrifice. But perhaps in my frustration of the ladder not working in the way I intended for it to be, an even better thing came of it. Because as you can see from the speed build, I now start working on a cave. Now, this was never in the original vision of the map, but it's something I've wanted to try for a long time, and I'm extremely happy by the final result. It's by no means a very big cave, in fact it would probably only take you 5 seconds to run through it, but nonetheless I'm still very proud of how it came out. Instead of the militia team's camp being just that, a campsite on a hill, I wanted to add something very natural and special to this section of the map, as opposed to just a few buildings and tents here and there. The cave at the back of the campsite acts as an additional spawn point, but is also a pretty decent and sneaky spot to hide or flank around the back of the militia campsite without being spotted. And so through a combination of cave assets and the same alpine rocks that I've been using throughout the entirety of the rest of the map, I just decided to start putting through a cave silhouette together. And so what I started doing first is I spawned all the cave assets at the beginning, and the interesting thing with the cave assets in Far Cry 5 in the map editor is I believe there's about 3 different cave color palettes that you can use. There's a pretty dark kind of almost like a molten rock cave in terms of it being very black. And then there's the cave that I use, or the cave assets that I'm using today, which is kind of more of a neutral color. At least I feel like this is the type of cave that you would use for these types of forested maps. And I think the blacker cave, well, maybe you just use it for, I don't know, a more darker environment or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. But there was another cave system as well. I can't exactly remember what it was now, but either way, I decided to go for the second cave color palette that I mentioned because it seemed the most appropriate in a woodland setting. It kind of reminds me of a cave that's got a bit of moss attached to it, and as you can see from the entirety of the rest of the map, there's quite a lot of alpine forest rocks that I've used that has moss growing on it. So I wanted to kind of be faithful to that kind of I guess aesthetic. And so that's what I ended up going for. And so first off, I kind of just made sort of a little tunnel out of the cave assets. Like I said, it's not a massive cave, so it was just kind of putting everything in kind of like an L shape to kind of make it a little bit of a natural kind of pathway for the player. And then as you can see here, I just start layering all these different types of rocks onto the cave to really kind of make it look really realistic. And another method that I like to use, and it's a method that Builds has actually mentioned himself in his own map builds, is that it really helps to twist the rocks around in different sorts of angles and all sorts of different kind of, I guess, directions, because it really makes each rock feel like a different kind of rock and not the same rock copy and pasted over and over again. And it really kind of makes the whole environment look so much more natural, as opposed to just kind of using the same rock and placing it on the map everywhere. You definitely want to kind of try to move it around. And here I'm just kind of going back into explore mode, just trying to ensure that the pathway is nice and smooth, that there's not too many obstructions in the way, so that when players are actually going through the cave, they're not bumping into things. Because whilst I want to make the cave very claustrophobic, as it is indeed a cave and it's a dark kind of dingy sort of place, I don't want player movement to be impeded. And so that's just something that I really had to kind of tinker with in terms of the width of the cave to make it wide enough that players could freely move through it, but still claustrophobic, that it would feel like a really dark, dingy environment that you would expect from a cave. Now I start working a little bit more on the campsite itself, and so what I decide to do is I decide to add another point of interest here in the form of a boardwalk, almost like an observation point that kind of overlooks this sort of, I guess, hill or valley or however you want to call it. I've realized that during the creation of this speed build video, I am becoming a lot more familiar with all the different terminology for different landforms and terrain and geography and all that sort of thing. So it's pretty fun, but it's also kind of a bit iffy because I don't really know if I'm actually calling something the right type of landform or terrain type. But I am kind of learning, so hopefully I can continue to improve the commentary as we continue to, I suppose, expand on this series. And so what I just did then is I also added some spikes to the side of the hills in keeping with kind of the cautiousness of this militia outpost in the middle of the forest, that they don't really want any intruders, and so those spikes that I add on the side of the hill is to kind of stop anyone from climbing up that side of the cliff, but it's also to kind of warn off people that this is a very private area and it's an area that a lot of people aren't welcome at. I remember when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, there was some kid in my class who thought that anyone who had spikes on the gates of their houses was someone who just didn't want anybody to come anywhere near the house. And, at the time I thought that was a bit of a silly notion, but, I think it kind of makes sense in a kind of superficial sense. It's not necessarily true. I think people just kind of like the idea of spikes on their fences, but I can kind of see why people might think that people who have spikes on their fences might just be wanting to keep people out, particularly if those spikes are particularly sharp. Wow, I'm saying particularly a lot in this video, but I feel like a lot of spikes are kind of more just for show, just for decoration, but the spikes I add on this map are definitely very sharp. Now I continue working on the surrounding terrain around the cabin at the back of the campsite, and this cabin kind of is the conduit for the secret flanking route for the militia team this time around, with that zipline that provides an expressway for them to get down the hill very quickly. It also is where the grapple point is, although I actually placed that grapple point slightly to the right of the cabin on top of the rocky structure next to it, the tall rocky structure. And so yeah, I basically continue to work on the terrain here, adding some trees, adding some rocks to the cliff face, really trying to add to that realism and just trying to adjust the rocks here, because every single time I tried to kind of place them onto the terrain, because I was using quite a large rock face, they kept kind of clipping underneath the cabin floor, which didn't look very realistic, so it just took a bit of adjusting back and forth to try and rectify that issue. And so here I start just coloring in the terrain more and adding some more trees, really trying to bring the map to life and make it look supernatural. As you can see here, I continue to work on the campsite a little further, and I wanted to add kind of some tree cover, like a tree line at the back of this campsite towards the kind of higher cliff, and also just continue to play around with the different collection tools, such as these wildflowers, I suppose you could call them. These wildflowers are a really versatile kind of collection tool that you can use on the map, because you can basically use them anywhere. And they're kind of interesting in terms of their height, because they're not so tall that you can kind of hide in them. And the other cool thing about them is that they have some sort of like physics attached to them, where you as the player, when you move through them, they actually move out of the way. Now, that could cause some issues if you're trying to make a map where you're trying to use that grass as a stealth option, because it pretty much is the tallest grass asset that you can kind of use, or collection tool. But it's not really something you can actually use as a stealth tool, because they do sway out of the way. But it's still a pretty cool feature that I suppose Ubisoft added. And I like those flowers. I kind of put them everywhere around the map, close to the cliff faces, on the open grass patches, and just kind of here and there, really trying to bring vibrancy to the map itself. Now I'm working on kind of like the front entrance campsite sort of hut, I suppose. And this is where I basically kind of put all the weapons munitions for the militia team. So this is where all their kind of ammunition is, all their guns, and I also put an extra bed inside that hut because the sleeping arrangements for this campsite are already pretty low. There are some tents, as you saw, but I feel like those tents can only really fit 1 or 2 people at max. And so I add kind of a bunk bed inside that little hut, as well as a mattress sort of bed. And also, yeah, just start putting food stores around the map as well, including this toilet. And no, yeah, the toilet isn't food, but anyway, it's obviously good to have the proper toilet facilities anywhere you go, so you can unload a different kind of ammunition. Anyway, moving on. We'll move on from that bit of. We'll move on from that interesting comment I made back then. But yeah, now I am just going back, continuing to kind of detail this cliff face here, trying to move the rocks around, adding smaller rocks to that cliff face, really trying to make it look very natural looking. And you actually see in this map build that a lot of what I do is I actually go back and forth between different areas on the map, whether that be to duplicate rocks on the cave section to bring over to the cliff over here to save myself time from going into the actual map asset browser, or sometimes I kind of just like to flip between different areas of the map and work in different parts of the map at the same time and kind of go back and forth, because I feel like that kind of gauges my interest as a map creator a lot better. Rather than solely focusing on just one particular part of the map, I definitely like to switch it up and work on a few different areas simultaneously. So I'm kind of gauging my interest in a lot of different ways, and that way I feel like I'm, I guess, a little bit more passionate about the map that I'm building. Because I feel like if you're building just one particular part of the map and you're only focusing on that bit, it can also kind of give you a bit of short-sightedness, because you might become too focused on that part of the map and then kind of neglect other parts. But also, if you're only working on one part of your map, it can sometimes get a bit old and you can sort of start to get map editor burnout. So working on a few different areas at one time can definitely prevent that map burnout from happening and can just make you, I guess, a little bit more enthused about your map creation. Here you can see me adding the finishing touches to the SWAT team secret flank route, where I add a grapple point and also a climbable ledge, just to give them the option of whether they want to use the grapple point itself to climb up that cliff face, and then if they want to, they can also use that ledge point to then get on top of the bigger rock as well. Now I'm adding one final structure to the campsite in the form of a provisions building. And this provisions building is made entirely out of wood, or most of it is, because again, I wanted to pay homage to the fact that this is a militia out in the woods and that they're pretty resourceful, that they use the natural resources around them to kind of build most of their campsite. And so, yeah, this is the provision structure, which also just is kind of a storage area for them to store food and that sort of thing. And I also add another bed in there. You know, you can never have enough beds, as I seem to have adopted throughout the entirety of the campsite. But also during the map build, I realized that I couldn't really just have a campsite where it was a hill with some tents on top of it. I needed to have some extra points of interest for the players, but also some physical structures where I could place spawn points, because I didn't really want the militia team just to spawn out in the open. I wanted there to be a physical structure that they could spawn in or behind, in the interest of providing some additional spawn protection so that they're not immediately exposed if there happens to be a SWAT team member who is up on the militia campsite. Now, how I actually put the provision structure together is I use a generic shape for the flooring and change the texture to a wooden kind of old pattern. Then I use the tarps. I think they're from the Hours of Darkness category, to create a nice roof over the top that is kind of militaristic in a sense. And then I also use the wooden spiked fences that I've used quite a bit throughout the map, especially for the front entrances of the campsite and at the very bottom of the hill. Because whilst the campsite is where the militia is primarily based, they've put that fence at the bottom hill for the entire area because this is sort of like their secret sanctuary. Nearing towards the end of the build, I'm just finishing off the campsite by filling in the rest of the empty space with different collection tools and the paint texture to bring it all to life. And I quickly jump into explore mode as I do throughout the entire process of building the map to see that everything is like how I want it from a visual perspective, but also a kind of physical perspective in terms of where everything is positioned, just to make sure that it's going to be good from a multiplayer perspective in terms of player movement not being impeded by anything on the ground, but also that the sight lines are nice and clear. And for this particular part of the map where the campsite is, I'd say that this is kind of like a medium to long range type engagement because it's a pretty open area across the campsite. You can pretty much see someone from one side of the campsite to another. And so apart from maybe the cave and some of the structures within, like the provision structure or the weapons munition hut, everything else is kind of pretty far from each other. With the campsite done, I now head on to the other side of the map where the SWAT team is going to spawn. And if I'm being honest, I really didn't know how to kind of do the SWAT team spawn. And this was primarily because with the militia team, them having kind of like this secret kind of compound in the woods made sense, but you wouldn't really be finding any kind of major police station out in this secluded area. And I kind of wanted the narrative of the story to be that the SWAT operatives were dropped into the forest, or I don't know, dropped into the forest by helicopters or whatever. I don't really haven't really figured that one out, but regardless, that yeah, they were being dropped into the forest to infiltrate the militia team's compound, or the militia's compound rather. And yeah, there's not really any kind of base that I can kind of build for them because, you know, you can't exactly build a base next to a militia team's compound without them noticing. And so this kind of attack from the SWAT team was meant to be something that was kind of a secret. And so I just ended up spawning them in the woods, kind of behind some trees in sort of a ditch, and also this pathway that I built, spawning some of them there, just kind of spawning them all around the front side of the militia compound in areas that weren't super exposed. But in saying that, the SWAT team spawns are a lot more exposed and a lot more out in the open than what the militia team has. So hopefully this doesn't come back to bite me in the actual gameplay when I release this into the arcade. However, I don't think spawn trapping will be that big of an issue because I'll add some shared spawn points later on. And also, I believe that most of the combat will take place kind of in the middle of the map anyway, as you'd expect. And so I don't really think too many people are going to be coming all the way down the bottom of the hill. But we'll just have to cross our fingers and hope that that doesn't happen because there's not as much protection for the SWAT team if they are to get spawn trapped. But again, I think that with these shared spawn points, it should hopefully spawn the SWAT team members away from this initial spawning point if the militia team does happen to press them all the way down the hill. The other reason why I don't think it'll happen is because I think that the militia team, at least I'm guessing the player behavior, because obviously a lot of people who will be playing this map will just be randoms, but I'd expect that the militia team will kind of just want to defend their compound rather than be the attacking team, and especially because they have the high ground advantage, the militia team, I expect them to kind of just stay around their campsite or perhaps around the hill area and not want to come all the way down to the bottom of the hill. Whereas the SWAT team, if you're on the SWAT team, I feel like they're going to want to be more attacking because, like I said earlier, they do spawn in kind of an open, exposed area of the map. And so they'll probably want to advance further up the hill to seek cover. And because this is a pretty linear map, I feel like players from either team are going to want to attack each other because there really is only kind of a specific pathway that they can take towards the other team. It's not really an open world type map. And so, yeah, I feel like spawn trapping won't be as big of an issue, but those are some very famous last words. And again, we'll just have to cross our fingers and hope that it all comes out well. However, despite the SWAT team spawn being largely spontaneous and not really planned out at all, it was kind of an afterthought, I'll be honest. I actually did kind of enjoy having a part of the map that I could kind of just improvise on and build on the spot. And because the rest of the map was pretty well structured, as you would have seen from my cute little diagram I did on Word document earlier, that was kind of the structure that I was following for the map. And to kind of have the SWAT team spawn be a little bit more spontaneous and have a little bit more freedom in terms of what I could do in that particular moment, it meant that I could kind of just have a little bit of fun with trying to problem solve and trying to figure out some solutions. Solutions which you will see in a few short minutes when I head back to the SWAT team spawn to try and make it a little bit more dynamic. But before we get back into the SWAT team's campsite, here I am just finalizing the cabin and the provisions tent, the area around those structures, really trying to fill in all the gaps as I have been doing throughout the build, making sure that everything looks good, looks smooth, and looks natural, whether that be to add more rocks, to use the smooth terrain tool, or to add some trees as well. Just really trying to find ways to add cover in the form of different natural kind of elements to really complement this part of the map. And now you can see me adding an exterior wooden fence around this area as well. Like I said, this is a sanctuary for the militia. They want to keep people out. And so this is them just covering all bases, making sure that there is only one entrance in and out of their compound. Now I start working on building the larger world of the map by terraforming the terrain around the map beyond the playable area to make it a believable woodlands environment and also to prevent the immersion of the atmosphere and the environment of the map from being broken. I feel like it's a really good practice to not just build what is within the playable area of your map, but to also build it out slightly, whether that be to add city buildings around a city map, or in my case, adding more trees and terraforming the terrain and adding the vistas in the distance as well. Really just trying to bring the whole map to life to make it feel like it's a part of a larger world. And this is probably the one part of the map where you spend most of your time outside the playable area, but you have to try to balance it pretty well as you don't want to get too carried away with it, particularly in a linear map such as this one, where players aren't really going to be able to escape from outside the playable area, but you still want to make sure that if players are looking outside the playable area, that they still feel like they're part of a larger world. And you really want to hide those edges of the map from the player. And finally, we find ourselves back at the SWAT team spawn, and these are kind of the extra measures that I put at the spawn to make it a little bit more dynamic. It really is just adding more rocks, and I feel like that's kind of been the catchphrase of the whole video. Adding more rocks, adding more rocks, adding more rocks. But yeah, it's very true for a natural map, especially this one, which incorporates so many rock faces to the map. When I first started building on the map editor, I barely used any of the rocks and I just relied on purely the terrain, or rather, I didn't even choose to work with terrain at all. But I'm so glad I decided to start working on terrain, because if you can incorporate terrain into your maps, it can really make it stand out and be the difference between a very kind of boring map and a very dynamic map. So if you're thinking about using terrain or you don't want to use terrain at all, I would definitely recommend getting around it as soon as possible. The last addition I implement into Forest Friction is this campfire right next to the boardwalk, which I place as the final detail, the final cherry on the top, I suppose you could call it. And this campfire kind of also acts as, I suppose, a landmark, perhaps for the SWAT team. As they come up the hill, they can see the smoke, and that's kind of a guide further for where they should go. And then I also add these log seats around the campfire, really bringing in, again, the nature and the natural resources into the environment. And then we come to the final tour of the map, where I basically show you guys the map in a first person perspective. This is going from the SWAT team spawn, and you'll notice that the environment is pretty different, not in terms of the terrain, but more so in terms of the atmosphere and the environment settings. Basically, what I did off camera is I added a bit of fog and I changed the time of day to make it a little bit more realistic. These are settings I edited off camera purely because I didn't feel like they were actually part of the map build itself. I mean, the environment is definitely part of the built environment, I suppose, but because it takes me so long to tinker with the environmental settings, I just decided to do that off camera. I also do the loadouts, the spawns, and a few other things like that off camera because I feel like those are more so maintenance things that you kind of need to do to get your map out to a publishable state, but they are by no means actually part of the map build themselves. And so after the SWAT team bypass the main gate, they then come through this ravine with the arrow pointing towards the main hill incline. On the left you have the very exposed open field, where you probably don't want to go if you're a SWAT team member because of the gunner position on the top of the militia campsite. And whilst you can still see the gunner position in this kind of natural trench, if you crouch down, you're pretty much hidden from the bunker position completely, but you're also very well blended in by the surrounding nature, with it all being green and having dark shadows casting over this part of the map as well. And now you come to the main militia camp entrance. You head through the gates here, take either path on the left or the right. And right here we have our munitions hut, where the militia's weapons and ammunition is. You have a few of the tents on the side near to the cliff. Here you have the boardwalk, which overlooks the hill down there and the field as we just came up it. You can see the bunker structure there, and as we head back down the stairs of this boardwalk, we pass the campsite with the campfire, and then we head into our little cave system, which, as you can see, I've layered lots of different rocks on top of each other to really give that natural cavey type feel, I suppose you could call it. And then we see the very tall trees that we put at the back of the campsite to really give a lot of scale to this environment. We pass the toilet blocks there, and we come into the bunker that overlooks the hill with the M60 mounted machine gun. And as you can see, this mounted machine gun has got quite a massive view over the main hill incline, which really stresses the importance of the SWAT team to use that natural trench closer to the cliff on the other side of the hill, where my character was just pointing towards. Coming down this kind of step down, we have the main cabin, and inside the cabin it's kind of already been furbished by the Hours of Darkness DLC. I did add a few extra things in here, but most of that is already pre-existing detail. And we come back out of the cabin and we head towards the provision structure, which is the food store for the militia. We can see that they've got all their pickled sort of fruits and vegetables in there, and a nice little bed as well, and also some supplies such as water and toilet rolls, because you can never have enough toilet rolls, am I right? But yeah, Now we come back through the cave, or do we? Okay, no, I'm just admiring the nature with the sun coming through the trees. But here I hop back on top of the cabin roof itself, and this is the little expressway that we've got going for the militia team to zipline down, which gives them a really quick shortcut down the hill if they are to find it. And just like the flanking route the opposite way for the SWAT team, for them to grapple up onto that rocky sort of cliff face, whether you are using the expressway because you're part of the militia team or the secret flanking route as the SWAT member, both of those methods of transportation for this map kind of just reward players who are willing to be a little bit more explorative with this map. And here you are looking at the Bear's Den, which I actually didn't record in this speed build. I actually forgot to press record because I was so enthused about trying to figure out how I could use this part of the map, and then when I started building it, I simply forgot to press record, unfortunately. But you guys didn't miss out on much. I just added a bear, a spawn animation, or a couple spawn animations, and some dead animal carcasses, blood and bones to the bottom bit of this canyon. I also realized that the spawning animation points actually don't really make sense in a multiplayer match, because when there's 12 enemy players running around the bear or running all over the map, the bear is just not going to obey the animation points at all. But again, it's just something that I got a little bit carried away with. But this wraps up the speed build commentary for Forest Friction, just the second speed build commentary on the channel, and thank you all very much for tuning in. Also, congratulations are in order for anyone that was able to make it through the entire video. It's no easy feat watching a 1 hour long video, let alone listening to an entire hour of just my voice, so if you were able to, a massive congratulations. For those of you who are new around here, a massive welcome to the channel. As you see, I produce purely Far Cry content, so if that's something you're interested in, then please consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon for more on Far Cry. Finally, if you enjoyed the map or video, please consider liking the video and commenting on what you thought of this speed build. This whole process of building the map and making the video was an extremely long one, so I'd appreciate any extra support you could show me in the form of a like and or comment. But otherwise, I'm Braddels Gaming, I'm signing out now, and remember to have yourselves a great day.